featuring Steve Levitsky very shortly. His talk is Global Democracy in Danger. You can start coming in. I have a few housekeeping announcements as you come in. After Steve Levitsky finishes speaking, we will conclude our events here at the Dom Ladi, and we will move to the Sarajevo City Hall, where the mayor of Sarajevo will welcome us in a reception. We all want to be there at 5:15 so we can hear from the mayor. And after that, we will have our awards ceremony there at Sarajevo City Hall. So this is a slight change from the schedule before we arrived. It should be up to date in the app. But just keep in mind, we'll have approximately 45 minutes to get to the Sarajevo City Hall, and it's about a 15-minute walk. While we are coming back into the main area here, I want to take the opportunity to say a few more thank yous. I really want to thank our wonderful partners here, Zastone. We've all known Zastone as the fact checkers of Bosnia. Their Point Conference, if you've never been, you should try to come. It's a wonderful conference on democracy and fact-checking in the entire region. And our Zastone partners really made this conference possible. They've been welcoming, they've been collegial, they've had an army of volunteers. It just really impresses me the way they come together to carry out their mission. Darko and Tiana have long been colleagues of mine, but just from the bottom of my heart, on behalf of the Poynter Institute and the International Fact-Checking Network, thank you, Zastone. Thank you. I do want to thank a few colleagues who've helped us put on this event from the Poynter Institute. Our conference reporters have been Laura Ben and Angela. I hope you've met them. And Josie Hollingsworth has assisted on our multimedia. The conference coverage is ongoing. Once you get home, you'll get another email from us that summarizes all of our coverage. We hope this will be good outreach to those fact checkers who weren't able to be here, and also a way to reach the general public and our supporters who would like to know more about fact-checking and what we're doing at the conference. And I would welcome any of you to plan your own conference coverage, or if you'd like to translate our pieces, just get in touch with the IFCN staff. We want to spread the wonderful workings of our conference as much as we can. I would also like to thank the Poynter producer staff. That's Adam, Alo, and Julia. If you've been a speaker, you've met them backstage. They've been working with the Zastone tech team. They really have helped give us a smooth production. Our events team, Angie Lowry, Laura, and Sarah, thank you so much. You handled so many logistics. You got all the signage. You kept us all running on time. You helped us make our travel arrangements. Thank you for that. I really appreciate you. And then last but not least, the wonderful IFCN staff. Ferdy, our deputy director, worked tirelessly on our schedule and our sessions here. Deirdre and Arena were doing all of our grants work and put together the great workshop this morning. Lane Dvorak helped coordinate sessions and answered emails from all of you while she was doing her important training work. Sal, our Code of Principles staffer, kept answering a bunch of questions on the code, and he helped us develop all our relationships with you fact checkers who are here. And Enak Nyariki, our community and impact manager, again, helped us with all sorts of communication aspects. And I just want to say about the IFCN staff, I was the new director last year, and they could not have been warmer and more welcoming to me. We have a great team. We're trying to serve you as our community. And I just thank you to the IFCN staff. All right, now it is my time to introduce Steve Levitsky. So if you're standing on the sidelines, come into the main area. Sorry. Okay, not yet. Our final session, not quite yet. Well, come on out. Yeah, sure, Steve. Come on. Come on. This is Steve Levitsky. Welcome him. Our closing keynote speaker is Steve Levitsky. Steve is a professor of government at Harvard, who I got to study with during my Nieman Fellowship in 2002, where he directs the Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. So all our Latin American fact checkers, he's a specialist. He is the author of a classic book, How Democracies Die, written with his co-author Daniel Ziblatt. That book is about democratic backsliding and how elected leaders gradually subvert the democratic process to increase their power. It looks at countries such as Russia, Venezuela, and the United States, among many others. I consider it one of the most important political books of the past 10 years, and anyone interested in politics and democracy should read it. Steve takes an empirical approach to his work, always looking at facts and evidence. But as you'll see, he's a great storyteller, never forgetting the human side of politics and the foundational stories of the political leaders who have shaped history. When I invited Steve, I thought he would talk to us about competitive authoritarianism, which is when elections continue, but they're no longer free or fair. He literally wrote the book on competitive authoritarianism with his colleague Lucan Way. But Steve's new research, and what he's here to talk to us about today, is a topic that will let us close this conference on a hopeful note after we've discussed so many challenges and threats. His talk today is about democracy's surprising resilience. Please welcome Steve Levitsky.
So I was all prepared to close this conference on a hopeful note, as Angie said, and then I watched the US presidential debate last night. And so I actually do not know why I accepted to do this lecture. Not only am I following Maria Ressa, which is impossible, but I just realized I'm giving a lecture in front of a room full of fact checkers. My undergraduates, they don't check my facts. They're too busy checking Instagram to check my facts. So this is a level of scrutiny I'm not used to. I am actually going to offer a less pessimistic view of the state of global democracy today. That does not mean I'm going to deny the many threats that democracies face. Those threats are very real. Many of them have been discussed at this conference. But the main message I want to give to you is that the idea that the world is succumbing to Chinese or Russian-style authoritarianism is completely off the mark. The forces sustaining pluralism and competition and pro-democratic forces remain very strong across much of the world. And that is important because it means that you guys, although there are days in which this seems otherwise, it means that you guys are not working in vain. What you guys do matters. The democratic forces continue to have a fighting chance across much of the world. All right. The third wave of democratization, starting in the 1970s, brought an unprecedented degree of democratization. Between 1975 and 2000, the number of democracies in the world nearly tripled. Whereas democracy had once been confined mostly to the industrialized West, it now swept across East Central Europe, across Latin America, and made a lot of headway in Africa, the former Soviet Union, and Asia. That unprecedented democratization of the late 20th century, see if I can work this. No. Not at all. Okay. Yes. Triggered a wave of optimism back in the 1990s about democracy's future. During the 1990s, some of you, I see, are young, but some will remember, Western-style democracy seemed like it was becoming universal. Scholars wrote about the end of history. My former professor, Larry Diamond, one of the world's leading democracy experts, went around the world giving speeches entitled, "Can the Whole World Become Democratic?" Over the last decade or so, that mood has shifted pretty dramatically. The unbridled optimism of the 90s gave way to mounting pessimism about the global state of democracy. Suddenly, democracy seemed to be dying everywhere, from Venezuela and the Philippines to Hungary to Turkey to India, maybe even to the United States. About a decade ago, the NGO Freedom House declared that democracy was in retreat and warned of a global authoritarian resurgence. In its 2018 report, 5 years ago, Freedom House told us that democracy faces its worst crisis in decades. Another major global democracy index, VDEM, tells us that we have entered a third wave of autocratization. Terrible word. One of VDEM's recent annual reports is entitled Democracy at Dusk. Democracy at Dusk. So there is a broad consensus today that democracy is in decline across the world, that authoritarianism is on the rise. You journalists treat this basically as a given. But we need to fact check that claim. Sorry, I could not resist. I'm going to make the case today that democracy has actually been pretty damn resilient in the 21st century, and then I'm going to try to explain why that's the case. Now, to understand the case I'm going to make for democratic resilience, we have to consider the many challenges that democracy faces today. Those challenges, those threats to democracy, are both international and domestic. On the international front, the environment is far, far less favorable for democracy today than it was 30 years ago. Important not to forget this, but the 1990s and the early 2000s were a unique period in global history, one that was unusually, in fact, uniquely favorable to democracy. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States and Europe became the world's dominant military, economic, and ideological power. And they used that power in the 90s and early 2000s to promote democracy like never before and like never since. The EU in particular in Central Europe, the United States in Central America, and the Caribbean and elsewhere. For about 15 years, between the collapse of the Berlin Wall and, say, the Iraq War, democracy was the only game in town. There were no counter-hegemonic powers to which aspiring autocrats could turn for support. Russia was in a state of collapse. China was just beginning its rise. So developing countries across the globe 30 years ago had to be on good terms with the West. That post-Cold War international environment, one in which democracy was the only game in town and the EU and the United States were actively, aggressively, self-confidently promoting democracy, that environment gave rise to unprecedented democratization. The number of democracies in the world more than doubled between 1985 and 2005, in 20 years. And crucially, democracy emerged in this period in some very unexpected places. Over the years, social scientists don't know a hell of a lot, but we have learned in research over the last 60 years that there are several factors that make democracy much more likely to emerge and much more likely to survive. Industrialization, a big middle class, a robust civil society, relatively low levels of inequality, a functioning state bureaucracy. In other words, democracy is much, much more likely to take root in urban, industrialized societies with relatively low levels of inequality and functioning states. But in the 1990s, democracy emerged in a whole bunch of countries with none of those conditions. Countries like Albania, Benin, Ghana, Bolivia, El Salvador, Honduras, Madagascar, Mali, Mongolia, Nicaragua, Romania, I could go on. In other words, democracy dramatically overperformed in the 1990s. It emerged in some very unlikely places. That's not because established social science theories were wrong. It's because the international environment was so overwhelmingly favorable to democracy that it overwhelmed the impact of structural factors like wealth and class structures and state strength. But that unusually favorable environment could not last. Global conditions, as you know, have changed considerably over the last 2 decades. The rise of China, together with Russia's resurgence as an aggressive anti-liberal power, altered dramatically the geopolitical balance of power, putting an end to that 15-year period of Western liberal hegemony. Autocrats today can turn to China, to Russia, to other illiberal powers for assistance. And at the same time, as all of you know, the power and influence of the liberal West has declined. And in fact, many Western democracies, including my own, face growing illiberal threats from within. As a result of that, Western governments across the West, Europe, United States, have lost both the will and the capacity to effectively promote democracy abroad. The EU, which played such a critical role in Southern Europe in the 1970s, in Central Europe in the 1990s, did little to combat rising authoritarianism in Hungary. And the United States, which played a major role in Central America's democratization in the 1990s, did little to stop backsliding in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras in the 2010s. So the international environment is far less favorable for democracy today than it was in the 1990s. This has dramatically expanded autocrats' room to maneuver. It is simply much easier to be an autocrat today than it was 30 years ago. That's the external front. Democracies also face a bunch of domestic challenges in the early 21st century. Again, one of the central features of the third wave is that democracy emerged in a whole bunch of poor, unequal societies with weak states. Again, countries like Albania, Benin, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Madagascar, Mali, Nepal, Senegal. These are not easy places to govern. In countries with weak states, entrenched poverty and inequality, endemic corruption and criminal violence, governments almost invariably govern poorly. They fail to deliver decent public services. They fail to combat corruption. They fail to improve the lives of the poor, to protect citizens from violence. They fail at these things not because their intentions are bad, but because they inherited weak states. Their bureaucracies, their security forces. I don't think I'm even supposed to be on that slide yet, so listen to me, don't watch the slide. Their states, their bureaucracies. I don't know what is, oh, sorry, all right. Getting way ahead of ourselves. All right. Governments govern badly across the global south, not because they're badly intentioned, but because they inherited weak states. Their bureaucracies, their security forces, the legal systems are understaffed. They're poorly trained. They are poorly equipped, and as a result, they're almost invariably plagued by inefficiency and corruption. Now, building an effective state, turning the Nicaraguan state into the Danish state, is a slow, difficult process. It's a process that at best takes decades. But voters don't give a damn about that. They want governments to deliver the goods. And when successive governments fail to deliver public goods, one after another, voters, understandably, grow frustrated. Crappy public services and persistently high levels of crime and corruption generate widespread public discontent and eventually widespread public anger. And eventually, citizens lose faith in the system. And in many cases, they turn to anti-system figures who promise to deliver the goods through autocratic means. People like Putin, Chavez, Duterte, Bukele. My basic point is there were good reasons to expect many third-wave democracies to fail. Democracy emerged in some really difficult places, countries like Albania, Benin, El Salvador, Madagascar, Mongolia, Mali, Nepal, Nicaragua, and the uniquely favorable international environment that encouraged widespread democratization in the 1990s was no longer there to protect those democracies. So we should expect some democratic decline in the 21st century, and in fact, that is what we have seen. Several of the democracies that emerged in really hard places in the 1990s did in fact break down in the early 21st century. Benin, Mali, El Salvador, Nicaragua. And in a handful of middle-income countries, many of them facing serious economic or security crises, also experienced democratic backsliding. I'm thinking about Philippines, Venezuela, Turkey, Tunisia. Now, observers looked at these cases and they concluded that democracy was in retreat, that the third wave of democratization had given way to a third wave of autocratization. But here, I think, is where we need to do a little bit of fact-checking. If you look at the actual, never, ever read VDEM annual reports, or you can read them, but don't take them seriously. If you look at the actual data presented by organizations like Polity, Freedom House, VDEM, what we see across organizations is a modest democratic decline. According to Freedom House, the number of free states, which is basically democracies, has declined from 96 in 2016 to 84 today. Decline of 6 democracies. According to VDEM, the number of democracies has declined from 96 in 2016 to 90 today. Again, a decline of 6. According to both Freedom House and VDEM, there are as many democracies in the world today as there were in the early 2000s, and there are many more democracies today than there were in the mid-1990s at the height of the third wave. So if we look at global democracy since 2000, let's see if I can get back here. Basically a flat line. Pretty close to a flat line. If that's the case, if there's basically a flat line in terms of global democracy since the early 2000s, why do we all think that democracy is in steep retreat? I want to suggest 3 reasons. First of all, we very often conflate the election of an illiberal leader, a bad guy, with backsliding. When an illiberal leader gets elected, we more or less automatically classify it in our minds as a case of backsliding. Now, illiberal leaders do in fact pose a threat to democracy, but they do not always kill it. US democracy survived the Trump presidency, the first one anyway. Brazilian democracy survived Bolsonaro. Czech democracy survived Babiš. Mexican democracy is very likely to survive AMLO. And Italian democracy should survive Meloni. So we should worry a lot about the election of illiberal leaders, but we can't assume that they bring backsliding. Often they do not. A second reason why perceptions of global autocratization outstrip reality is that backsliding often proves short-lived. Many of the democracies that, many of the governments that subverted democracy in the early 21st century lost power within a decade. And their countries eventually slid back to democracy. We saw this most recently in Poland, but we've seen similar slide backs in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Honduras, in Malawi, Zambia, Moldova, Senegal, Sri Lanka, Ukraine, and other cases. It's a fair number of cases. A third reason why the reality of democratic decline doesn't match perceptions is that backsliding cases have been at least partially offset by democratic advances in other countries. We all know about democratic backsliding in Hungary, in India, in Turkey, in Venezuela, because those cases get a lot of attention, and they should get a lot of attention, for good reason. I think just one more slide. This is work. But there have also been major democratic advances over the last 15 years in a bunch of countries, from Armenia to Colombia to the Gambia to Liberia to Malaysia to Moldova and Nepal. These gains receive less attention than the backsliding cases. I mean, Hungary gets 1,000 times more attention than cases of democratic advance like Malaysia. Because many backsliding cases have in fact reversed, like Poland and Ecuador, and because many backsliding cases have been offset by democratic advances, like in Liberia, Armenia, Malaysia, the overall level of democratic backsliding has been modest. Now, place that modest decline. Again, the world has lost 5 or 6 democracies. place that modest decline in broader historical context. Remember two things in particular. First, much of the backsliding occurred in countries where democracy faced really steep odds to begin with. Benin, Mali, Nicaragua, El Salvador. There's not a theory on earth that expects democracy to be stable in those countries. And second, recall that international conditions have become much less favorable to democracy in the 21st century. So the world is still considerably more democratic than it was in the 1990s, despite the rise of China, despite Putin, despite Trump, despite social media, despite AI, despite COVID. To me, that suggests a fair amount of democratic resilience. So the question is why? Why have the vast majority of third wave democracies actually survived into the 21st century, despite the fact that the uniquely favorable conditions that gave rise to many of those democracies have now disappeared? I want to suggest two reasons. The first is economic development. Economic development. There continues to be a super powerful correlation between economic development and democracy. If you set aside oil states, which are markedly different, leave aside the Persian Gulf, the World Bank classifies 53 countries in the world as high income. 51 of those 53 countries are democracies. The only exceptions are Singapore and Hungary. Why? Economic development disperses resources. It disperses resources away from the state and across society. Resource concentration is the recipe for autocracy. When the state controls the main sources of wealth and income, most citizens are going to depend on the government for their livelihood, for jobs, for income, for housing, for loans, for contracts. Governments almost always exploit that dependence by denying or threatening to deny essential resources to their critics and their opponents. So people who support the opposition may be fired, may be denied housing, loans, or scholarships. Businesses that finance opposition parties or finance independent media may lose access to loans, licenses, government contracts. Democracy absolutely requires opposition. If there's one thing that sustains democracy, it's opposition. And sustainable opposition requires two things. It requires autonomous citizens, and it requires an independent private sector. Citizens who fear losing their jobs, their income, or their housing are not even remotely autonomous. They're highly vulnerable to clientelism. They are far less likely to risk their livelihoods by joining protests or joining an opposition group. Businesses that depend on state credit, state licenses, subsidies, contracts are unlikely to finance opposition parties or independent media. So when resources are concentrated in the state, when the government has access to most resources, it's really hard to sustain the opposition. Individuals, organizations that lack independent access to resources eventually get co-opted or beaten up by the government, essentially starving the opposition out of existence. Quickly, there are authoritarian resource concentration can take three forms, three basic forms. One is an excessively statist economy, an economy where the government has too much discretionary control over economic levers of power. China, Russia, Belarus, Singapore. 60% of the Russian middle class is employed by the government. That makes it impossible to build a middle-class opposition movement. A second form of authoritarian resource concentration is the petrostate, is oil. Thanks to massive oil revenue directly into the state, Persian Gulf monarchies control the vast bulk of societal resources, which means that citizens depend heavily on the government for their livelihood. Most people don't want to bite the hand that feeds them, which is exactly why 20 of the 21 major oil producers are autocracies today. Tiny Guyana is the only exception. All major oil producers except Guyana are autocracies. But historically, here I'm getting back to my argument, the most common source of authoritarian resource concentration is poverty. It's underdevelopment. In poor agrarian societies, resources are almost always concentrated in the hands of the state
and a small group of landowners. It is hard to build robust opposition movements when you have a predominantly rural society, small working and middle classes, and a weak private sector. Capitalist development brings a deconcentration and dispersion of resources. It creates what Luke and Wei and I call countervailing societal power, financial, organizational, human capital that opposition groups can tap into. What do I mean by this? Industrialization produces a larger and wealthier private sector. A larger and wealthier private sector is harder to co-opt. It's harder to bully onto the political sidelines. It's better equipped, therefore, to finance opposition parties, civil society organizations, independent media. Industrialization produces a more autonomous citizenry, urban citizens who do not depend on the state for their livelihood. Citizens who earn a decent living outside the state are much less prone to clientelism. And crucially, they have the time, they have the disposable income to consume independent media, to join civil society organizations, to participate in opposition movements. Finally, industrialization enhances society's capacity for collective mobilization and collective organization. Urbanization brings people together. It facilitates collective action. You get stronger trade unions. You get stronger student movements. You get a denser landscape of civic organizations. So capitalist development generates independent sources of economic and social power. It disperses power away from the state. Higher incomes, wealthier private sectors, bigger cities, stronger middle classes, stronger working classes produce countervailing societal power. That means opposition forces have deeper pockets. It means they have stronger organizations. It means they have larger activist and voting bases. Countervailing societal power does not automatically bring democracy, but what it does do is it makes it a hell of a lot more difficult for autocrats to establish themselves or sustain themselves in power, because it's harder to co-opt opposition parties that have access to independent sources of finance. It's harder for autocrats to win or steal elections because voters are less prone to clientelism and more accessible to the opposition. It's harder to repress the opposition because society has a greater capacity to mobilize and protest. Now, what does any of this have to do with global democracy? Here's the thing. The world is a lot wealthier, a lot more developed today than it was at the beginning of the third wave. Again, leaving aside oil states, the number of high-income countries in the world, according to the World Bank, has more than doubled, from 25 in the mid-1980s to 53 today. So whereas half a century ago, there were a couple dozen rich countries concentrated mostly in Western Europe and North America, the developed world now encompasses Southern Europe, East Central Europe, the Baltics, and parts of East Asia and South America. And you know what? Democracy is taking root in every single one of those regions. 21 third wave democratizers have reached high income status, have become rich since 1975. I'm going to read them to you. Argentina, Bulgaria, Chile, Croatia, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Greece, Latvia, Lithuania, Panama, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, South Korea, Spain, Taiwan, Uruguay. Of the 21 countries I just read to you, 20 of them are stable democracies today. Hungary is the only exception. Hungary is the only exception. So one reason why global democracy has been resilient is that rich countries are overwhelmingly democratic, and the number of rich countries in the world has more than doubled. The other source of global democratic survival is a little messier. It's authoritarian weakness. When we think of autocracies today, we tend to think of China. We tend to think of Putin's Russia. We think of strong, robust dictatorships. Bullshit. Most new autocracies are fragile. You know why they're fragile? Because they inherit weak states. Remember how democracies in weak states tend to be plagued by poor economic performance, by corruption, insecurity, crappy public services, which generates widespread public discontent. Most autocracies in the world today, most new autocracies, face exactly the same problems. Governments with weak states have a hard time monitoring dissent. They have a hard time repressing protest. But even more importantly than that, they have a hard time governing well. They fail to deliver economic results. They fail to deliver public services to protect their citizens. And when autocratic governments fail to deliver the goods, they also face problems of public discontent. Think about how the Rajapaksa family was run out of town in Sri Lanka, the fall of Yanukovych in Ukraine, or more recently, the protests against Ruto in Kenya. In fact, over the last 15 years, autocratic or autocratic-leaning governments have either lost elections or been forced to cede power in Albania, in Bolivia, in Brazil, in Ecuador, in Georgia, Honduras, Guatemala, Malawi, Moldova, Nigeria, Peru, Poland, Senegal, Sierra Leone, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Ukraine, and Zambia. That's a lot of countries. That's a lot of countries where authoritarianism has failed. Now, the fall of an autocratic turnover isn't the same thing as democratization, and many of those regimes have not fully democratized. But the fact that autocrats are consistently failing to consolidate power is a big deal, because would-be autocrats don't have the time to build durable corruption networks, durable patronage networks. They don't have time to establish full control over the courts, over the army and the police, over other key institutions. And that instability, that inability to consolidate control over the state gives democratic forces a fighting chance. It's what gives the opposition a fighting chance. So when you hear talk about authoritarian resurgence, keep in mind that most of these new autocracies are as weak and as unstable as the democracies they replaced. They're vulnerable. They fail a lot. That's important because it magnifies the importance, the role of independent media and NGOs. You guys can and do make a difference in these cases. All right. I didn't travel all the way to Sarajevo to deliver good news. So I want to conclude, spend a few minutes concluding by highlighting and maybe offering a new take on one of the most serious challenges that face democracies today, and that's the challenge of populism, the election of anti-establishment outsiders who promise to throw out the entire political elite. Populist candidates are winning elections today much more frequently than at any time in history before. We see it everywhere from Mexico and El Salvador to Brazil and Argentina to Italy and the United States. Populists win elections with a promise to bury the political elite, to drain the swamp, to sweep away the corrupt oligarchy. They basically promise to take the whole political elite, put it in a bag, and throw it in the river. When populists actually deliver on that promise, when they go after the old elite, it generates intense polarization and conflict, which can destabilize and sometimes kill democracy. Fujimori, Chavez, Erdogan, Bukele, Trump. Populists don't always kill democracy, but they certainly threaten it. So why are so many populists getting elected in these days, in the last decade or two? Most scholars focus on the demand side of populism. They ask why people are so angry that they vote to throw out the entire political elite. They vote for a celebrity or a former general or a clown who promises to throw out the whole elite. Some scholars, as you know, point to economic anxieties rooted in globalization and rising inequality. Others point to changes brought by immigration, cultural change. The public mood was almost certainly worsened by the pandemic. All of that, as you know, was exacerbated by social media. That's an important discussion of the causes, the demand side of populism. But I want to talk about the supply side of populism. And it is simply a lot easier to be a populist today than it was 50 years ago. Because political establishments, what I'm going to call political establishments, are weakening across the globe. For most of our modern history, political establishments supplied the resources that politicians needed to get elected. Think about, for simplicity's sake, 3 types of establishment organization: political parties, major interest groups, business associations and unions, and major traditional media outlets like newspapers and network television. Political parties are important because they're the ones who nominate candidates for higher office. Where parties are strong, their control over candidate selection allows them to act as political gatekeepers, to filter out anti-system candidates. Interest groups, traditionally, are a critical source of finance and other campaign resources. Candidates everywhere need resources, they need money, they need activists, and historically, business and labor associations have been the main source of those resources. Finally, access to major media outlets is essential to candidates' ability to reach voters. Now, establishments are nowhere monolithic actors. Parties, interest groups, media outlets do not constitute a single block, a single set of interests. There's always, as you know, competition among them. But collectively, political establishments do tend to impose certain parameters on politics, both in terms of political style and in terms of policy substance. There are certain norms that govern how politicians are supposed to behave, how they dress, what they say, how they treat one another, how they treat the media. There are certain policy positions that the establishment considers beyond the pale. And politicians who exceed those boundaries, who violate certain behavioral norms, who push certain extremist policies, they get shunned by the establishment. That means that party leaders won't nominate them. It means that major business associations, unions, and other interest groups will not fund them. It means that mainstream media won't cover them, or their coverage will be negative. Half a century ago, that actually mattered. That mattered a lot. Being shunned by the establishment mattered 50 years ago because establishments 50 years ago had a monopoly over the resources politicians needed to get elected. Party leaders controlled the candidate selection process. There were no primaries. So if you were not on good terms with the party bosses, you could not run for office. A relatively small number of interest groups provided the vast bulk of the finance. If you were shunned by big donors, you could not raise money. Finally, 50 years ago, a few major media outlets dominated the media scene. There were 2 or 3 major TV networks, a handful of influential newspapers. If the New York Times, the BBC decided you were unfit for office, you were shut out. The fact that established political parties, interest groups, and media monopolized access to the resources politicians needed to get elected meant that politicians had to be on good terms with the establishment. Politicians needed the approval of party leaders to run for office. They needed the approval of major interest groups to fund their campaigns. They needed the approval of traditional media outlets to reach voters. That dependence on the establishment had important consequences for democracy. 20th century politicians couldn't just respond to voters. They had to strike a balance every day between appealing to voters on the one hand and remaining acceptable to the establishment on the other hand. That was not particularly democratic, but it had a moderating effect on politics because it kept the more extreme politicians and issues off the agenda. But obviously, the days of establishment monopoly are over. They're done. Establishments across the globe have lost control, probably forever, over critical electoral resources, which means that they've lost power over politicians. Parties no longer monopolize candidate selection. Politicians can either hijack parties through primaries like Trump or create their own parties like Fujimori, Bukele, Milei, and many others. Interest groups have lost their monopoly over campaign finance because candidates can raise money online. Bernie flippin' Sanders raised more money than Joe Biden in 2020. Unthinkable 50 years ago. And of course, social media has eroded the influence of established media. Today, Twitter, Facebook, other social media allow candidates to reach voters, even if they're shunned by the mainstream media. So politicians in the 21st century don't need the establishment. That, for politicians, is incredibly liberating. They can now respond directly to voters without worrying what the establishment thinks. They can violate long-established norms. They can build a reputation as a maverick, as an outsider who's not beholden to the elite, who's willing to tell it like it is. They can say, they can do things that were previously off limits. Think about Trump, Bolsonaro, Bukele, Milei. In fact, candidates today, for the first time, can openly campaign against the establishment. And in fact, that's a good way to win votes, as all of you know. Arguably, there's always been a demand for populism. Voters have been angry in many countries for a long time. What's really new is the changes that are happening on the supply side. It is simply much easier to bypass the political establishment than it was 50, much less 100 years ago. When Perón took on and defeated the Argentine political establishment in 1946, it took the kind of mass mobilization that you see once a century. It took a freaking political miracle. When Bukele beat the Salvadoran establishment a few years ago, not that hard. He mobilized 2 million people via Facebook and Twitter. This new scenario is much more democratic than the older one. Politicians who don't need the establishment can be much more responsive to voters. They can give the voters what they want. But what happens when voters are so angry that what they want is somebody who will take a wrecking ball to Congress, the courts, and other institutions of representative democracy? This is the difficult paradox that we face today. On the one hand, the weakening of political establishments is unquestionably democratizing. It allows politicians to be more responsive to voters. It opens up the political system to a much wider array of groups and individuals. But that very democratization, that very opening up, leaves liberal democratic institutions vulnerable to anti-system forces. Back in the 18th century, Western elites were terrified of democracy. They were terrified of democracy because they equated democracy with rule by the people, God forbid. One of the things that made democracy acceptable to elites in the West was the protective power of political establishments. 19th and 20th century establishments imposed real constraints on democratic competition. They transformed what could have been highly plebiscitary, highly majoritarian politics into a much more bounded, elite-centered competition. But the days of elite democracy, for better or for worse, are over. The establishment's gatekeeping powers have eroded, I think permanently, which means that we're very likely to continue to see more Trumps, more Bolsonaros, more Bukeles, more Mileis. And how democracies will hold up in this new era of permanent populism, I think, is anybody's guess. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Really, thank you, Steve. That was really terrific. We will have some microphones. I'm sure you have questions. So if you have questions, go ahead and start raising your hands. I'm just going to ask one or two, and then we'll go to the audience. So wherever the microphone runners are. Steve, one of the things I really like about your work and your analysis is how systematic it is, how you're looking at how voters react, how leaders react, how the economy evolves. What is the role of the free press, the independent journalists, and the fact checkers in this big environment that you analyze?
Thanks, Angie. Look, as all of you know better than I do, the independent press, in whatever form, is part of that essential countervailing societal power that I was talking about earlier. Democracy requires opposition, and for people to oppose the government, they need information. And without, thus far, we've yet in any Western society to discover a means of providing independent sources of information to citizens without an independent media. So without an independent, self-sustaining media, it is impossible to guarantee citizens the information that they need to oppose the government. And if citizens can't oppose the government, you can't have democracy.
Yeah, one of the things that I really enjoyed in your class, Democracy and Authoritarianism, was when we would talk about how dictators and leaders would try to take power in an existing democracy. And some of the key things I remember was that first they tried to take out the independent courts and the independent media.
Right. We kind of liken, so today's path to authoritarianism is much less likely to be an old-style military coup, much more likely to be elected leaders themselves who undermine democracy. The first move that most autocrats or proto-autocrats make is to try to capture the referees, the institutions, whether it's courts, prosecutors, institutions that can investigate the government or that can be used as weapons to investigate and punish rivals. The second thing that elected autocrats try to do once they've captured the referees is go after, sideline the players, the independent or the opposition players, and the media are front and center there. But it's easier to go after the media once you have politicized the prosecutor's office, the tax agency, media regulatory agencies, the courts. Once you've weaponized those, then you've got tools to go after the media. So the media are second.
All right, I see Giovanni out there with the microphone. Please introduce yourself and give us your question.
Thank you. So my name is Giovanni Zagni. I'm from Italy. So thank you for your lecture. That was really insightful and very interesting. I have though one general and one and maybe two specific objections to your line of reasoning. First one concerns with the definition of democracy, which to me the underlying definition of democracy did not appear entirely clear. So I kind of saw an equivalence between democracy as a technical term for governing societies and liberal democracy, which is a political description of some values to be promoted by the political class. But those are two vastly different, and putting them together, I think I had the impression at certain points risk to cause confusion. So for example, listing Italy as one of the countries where democracy could be at risk is kind of, I don't know. Now the right-wing government has been there for 1.5 years, but I would say there are like zero actual actions that have been taken to make Italian democracies weaker. And if we go to vote again in 3 years, it's completely understandable if we want to change that. I don't see any risk to democracy in that. And so also using like the populism equivalency as the opposite to democracy, again, risk to put in the same basket vastly different experiences like Chavez and Meloni. To me, that sounds like kind of not entirely compressible. Okay. And finally, the two like specific ones. The connection between economic development and democracy leaves out like a huge exception, which is China. China in the last 50 years is responsible for basically building the middle class of the world.
Is China considered a high-income class country by the World Bank?
Okay. Oh, sorry.
It's
Problem
not.
is there. Okay. And then
Giovanni, come on.
the question of oil producers, maybe the exception of Norway. That's it.
Okay.
Still
Sorry I didn't define liberal democracy. Liberal democracy defined by is standard terms. This is really hard. By political science, a system in which all adults can vote, elections are free and fair, and citizens enjoy a broad array of civil and human rights, rights of association, right to publish, speech, assembly, association. So it is liberal democracy. You cannot have modern democracy without liberalism because you take away there's no such thing as Orban's illiberal democracy because you take away illiberal rights and free and fair elections go out the door. You have a tilted playing field in favor of incumbents. So my definition is standard
comparative politics definition of liberal democracy. On Italy, I agree 100% with you. That was the point. The point is, a lot of people, at least in the West, have been fretting, have been wringing their hands about Italian democracy. And in fact, Italian democracy, despite the election of a prime minister that many liberals in the West don't like, is perfectly fine. So agree 100%. Populism, my point was that not that populism is the opposite of democracy, but that populists sometimes threaten democracy. Not as often as some people say, but that populists have, by and large, been more likely than call them liberal politicians to threaten democratic institutions once they're elected.
Who has the microphone next?
And again, China's not rich enough.
Hi, I'm Eun Young. I'm from South Korea, one of the 21 richest states of your list. My question is short. How do we think about and deal with the 21st century's new establishment, the big tech company, such as Google, YouTube, and I think they can be demand side and also the supply side?
That is a really, really good question. Whether big tech companies, and particularly those looking into the future a little bit, those who are empowered by AI, whether they will become a new establishment. I am a terrible, terrible futurologist. I have a hard enough time explaining what happened that I don't predict the future well. But I think I'm going to completely punt on your question, but tell you I think you've asked the right question.
Next question. We have the microphones in the middle. I see Masato here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Masato Kajimoto from the University of Hong Kong. I know that you just said you are bad at predicting the future, but I'm old enough to remember Cold War days. And you said new autocracies are weak and fragile. It can collapse anytime. But at the same time, we do have powers like China who could subsidize those weak autocracies. They become more resourceful. If that's happening, then are we seeing Cold War II in the near future? What is your view on China's role in this?
I think, again, very hard to predict the future, but projecting based on what we've seen in the last 2 decades, movement away from a Western liberal hegemony to a more multipolar world, we've seen exactly that. We've seen, there was a day in the 1990s when very, very few autocracies could turn to an alternative powers and free themselves from Western liberal influence. Now, much more so, particularly in China's neighborhood, but really across the globe, it is increasingly possible for autocrats to turn to China for external support. In the Cold War, small client states were sometimes very stable. Those that had extensive support from either the Soviet Union or the United States, whether it was Malawi or Zaire or Cuba. So there is a world in which, as China grows in strength, if China remains an authoritarian, illiberal power, which I think it will be, more states could be stably propped up, more authoritarian regimes could be stably propped up by China. I think that change will be slow. I think it'll be partial. I don't think it means that robust democracies like South Korea, absent war, would come tumbling down, but it does mean that regimes like the one in Cambodia will be strengthened.
I've been following your lecture, and it seems that the numbers of democracies versus non-democracies is what you say it is, but don't you think that there are some other threats to democracy that, do not depend on the number of the countries, like there are non-democratic states, authoritarian states today, which are much stronger than in 1990s, or even if they're not stronger, they can create a ton of problems that they couldn't in 1990s. Like, for example, if Hong Kong would have been returned to China today, instead of in 1987, whenever it was, China today would never agree to one country, two systems, because it's much stronger. Then in early 1990s, you know, Soviet Union was falling apart, and you know, Russia was country in its knees. Today, Russia is something completely different. Like before the Ukraine war, they had $600 billion in reserves. And even after freezing half of their asses, they started the war with 300. Like they raised their military industry tenfold today. Then once again, Iran in 1990s was recovering from the Iran-Iraq war. Now they can develop nuclear weapons really quickly. North Korea was dealing with hunger in 1990s. Now they have nuclear weapons. Then, you know, in 1990s, European Union was much more compact body, and there were no outliers. Today, a small country like Hungary causes a lot of problems. It seems that the position of the non-democratic countries, even though they are not maybe, that they are a smaller country, it seems that at least for some of them, they have much more influence or ways to cause a lot of troubles.
So perhaps I wasn't clear, or perhaps you were in the bathroom during the first half of my talk, but that's precisely the argument that I'm making. The world has gone much, much more dangerous for democracy today in the 21st century compared to the 1990s. It is a much rougher terrain precisely because the EU has lost power and influence, precisely because Russia, China, Iran, and other states are in better economic, military, and political situation than they were 30 years ago. And yet, the level of democracy today is higher than it was in the 1990s. That is my argument. That's precisely my argument for democratic resilience.
Let me take the last question because we are running out of time. We're going to have to wind up. Well, I see Jan. I'm sorry, I can't say no to Jan. Go ahead.
I'll make it short.
And then I'll get the last question.
My name is Jan. I'm from Belgium, and in a former life, I made a PhD on populism. So I'm like, definitely, I was totally with you. And my question is the following: you painted like a global picture, but if you would only like focus on, let's say, a few Western democracies. My question is, if you go further where you stopped your lecture, what can we do? We're all fans of democracies. What can we actually do to make it even more resilient than it is today?
That's a great question. And I mean, not only, I don't speak for all political scientists, but I speak for at least some political scientists. We're bad at predicting the future. We're also very conservative. Conservative in the sense that those of us who study democracy for a living tend to be deeply, and I think overly attached to 19th and 20th century institutions of representative democracy. We want to preserve that. I want to preserve democratic institutions from Trump in my country. But I think, and we therefore have been slow, I think, too slow, to grapple with the fact that those institutions that have been, in many cases, largely unchanged for many decades, in the United States for longer than that, are proving insufficient, are proving insufficient for many citizens. So one thing that citizens, that politicians, and political scientists need to do much more of is thinking innovatively about how to reform our representative democratic institutions so that citizens feel better represented, better listened to. It's very difficult, with the partial exception of Uruguay and Portugal. It's very difficult to find a democracy today where citizens feel like, yeah, the system's working pretty well. Citizens do not feel represented. They don't feel like they have a voice. They don't feel like their politicians are listening to them, which is one reason why we're seeing the election of populists. But we haven't thought much about innovation. We've fallen into
preserving existing institutions because we're worried about what Trump or what others will do to them. But we need to think about ways of maybe using technology and innovating so that citizens feel better represented. I'm not well equipped to do that, but I think you've asked the right question.
Steve, just to conclude things, I remember when I took your class, the final class was about what you called the hard, grinding work of democracy. And one of the things I really liked about your analysis today and your class is you're taking a long view. Because one administration, even though 4 years in the US context seems like a long time, in the context of democracy, it's not that long. And a lot of the work of building democracy and preserving it does take place over a long time frame. When you look at the world and you look at the elected officials, the activists, the civil society that are working toward democracy, what do you think they should be thinking about this long-term horizon? What is the best way for them to keep up their work, maybe keep up their spirits when things seem kind of dark? And I know this isn't your area exactly, you're an activist, you're not an activist, but like, you see a long time horizon, and certainly your work in Latin America has looked at how things can change when we don't think they can change.
Again, I think it is important for you guys, for activists in general, to realize that the short-term work that you're doing, holding politicians, holding elected leaders, powerful people accountable for what they do. That what you do in the short term, that calling the prime minister out on her or his lie yesterday, even if it's a small lie, is contributing to building and sustaining norms of accountability. And norms of accountability, the belief by average voters, the belief by interest groups, the belief by, hopefully, internalized by politicians themselves, that they owe something to voters, that if they get caught in a lie, they should pay a price, that there is a cost to not being responsive to citizens. That norm is not built in a day and is extraordinarily important. I don't know exactly how the UK got its norms of sort of electoral accountability or democratic accountability, and those norms may be eroding relative to a few decades ago. But when British politicians screw up, they've got the chutzpah to step down. Or for decades and decades, we've lost that in the United States. Where does that norm come from? It didn't come from them. It didn't come from God. It came from citizens who fought, in the British case, for centuries to hold their leaders accountable. And you guys are doing the work of creating and upholding, in some cases, it may feel like you're holding by a thread, but holding on to those norms. And you cannot have a democracy if politicians don't feel any shame for lying or betraying the trust of citizens. The only place where norms of accountability can come from is from society. And you guys are at the center of that.
I think that's a great note to end on. Everyone will convene at the Sarajevo City Hall at 5:15, but right now let's conclude our program at the Dom Ladi, and thanks Steve Levitsky for speaking.
Thanks everybody.